Can you see it on YouTube? Tom, can you go onto my live and see if you can see it? No. Okay, you're... working? Yeah. Waiting? Is that it? Where's this thing? Where do I need to go? Onto you and then live. 14 waiting. Oh, no. Okay. It says we're live.
It's live. Yes, we are. Okay. I think people are watching stuff.
Hello, if you can see us, give us a wave. Could you send us a message in the chat? Welcome to Leipzig. I'm with Tom Greenleaf of the Leipzig Counterweight Orchestra. Hello everybody. It looks like there's some people watching. Welcome to the Heartbeat of the Orchestra, a fantastic exhibition in Leipzig of historical timpani owned by Bernhard Kohlberg. We're hoping to be joined by Leo Soto, who's flying in but been a bit delayed. But anyway, welcome. It's nice to see you again, Tom. Tom's hometown of Leipzig, and there are quite a few Leipzig timpanists featured this afternoon, including a living one, which is always a bonus. So, right, shall we get cracking?
Let's get cracking. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to have to do a bit of a walking tour around here. So we'll just start by talking about this little array of timpani here. So what we see here, the traditional timpani that were before about 1850 were hand-tuned. So this was the only way of tuning timpani, hand-screwed timpani, and most people might be familiar with these. And you can tune pretty quickly if you're experienced, but the problem with hand-tuned timpani, there are several problems. One is, obviously it takes a bit of time. The other problem is making sure the head is even and settled and with a true note across. And after you've done 2 or 3 tunings, it's quite easy to get quite a bit out. So that's the hand tune. So people felt we need to speed this up and we need to think of some clever ways. And in just this little row here, we have some of the solutions. So basically covering here are all the ways that people found of making timpani faster to tune. The first ones here are rotary tuned. So I turn that round. We're going to talk about these in a minute, but I'm just whizzing through them quickly. The next ones are pedal timpani, which I'm sure everyone will be familiar with. We're going to talk a lot about pedals. And then finally, we have some Viennese timpani. These are like the Schneller timpani, and they have a single handle. So basically, a single handle timpani is quite common. And the only one that's really missing here is the sort of chain or cable design, where there's something mounted around the top of the hoop. And that, with one handle, means you can tune quickly. Of course, all of them, except the pedals, you still have to not play with one hand. But if you think about how much we play without one hand, it's fine. So we'll talk a lot more about this. Should we whiz on?
Let's whiz on.
Right. First person to talk about is a very important man called Ernst Pfundt, who was chosen by Mendelssohn as the timpanist of the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra. Leipzig's a remarkable town. Within just a few hundred meters of here, Mendelssohn lived, Wagner was born, and Bach, of course, worked for years here. So Leipzig is an incredibly important musical city. It's the oldest. Tell us about the orchestra, Tom.
Yeah, so most of the oldest orchestras in the world are old opera orchestras, so court opera orchestras, mostly in Central Europe, sort of Germany, Austria, Hungary, Denmark a bit. But in Leipzig, it was formed the first symphony orchestra, so the first orchestra that was really, created to play concerts. And it wasn't funded by royalty, it wasn't funded by a royal court. It was really funded by the city itself and some philanthropists in the city. And that was formed in 1743. So we're not the oldest orchestra in the world, but we're the oldest symphony orchestra and the oldest one without royal financing. So that's us.
And Ernst Pfundt was appointed by Mendelssohn as the principal timpanist. Do you think they had more than one timpanist, or was it just one?
Back then, they only had one, and sometimes one of the percussionists would have played timpani as well, if on the rare occasions back then when there were opera and concerts, something like that happening at the same time, which was very rare back then. Now that's what happens all the time, which is why there are three of us. But back then there was generally one timpanist.
If you're thinking about the funny light, this is a very atmospheric room. There's no natural lights, all spotlights. The timpani will look fantastic, and we might be coming in out of shadow, so apologies about that. We'll try and do the best we can.
But you'll see the timpani great, and you won't see us, which is good.
The important stuff. So Ernst Pfundt was appointed by Mendelssohn as the principal timpanist, and he was played there till his death in 1871, and he would have probably, we know of lots of pieces that were premiered, or the German premiere in Leipzig, so we suspect that he was the first person to play quite a lot of pieces that we now call repertoire. Pieces like Elijah, first performed in Germany, in Leipzig in 1868, I think. His timpani. Now, what's amazing about these? There's a lot of timpani here, but the most interesting thing is that actually there are even more designs, some of them quite weird and crazy. But what we have here is kind of the best ones. These are all the Rolls Royces. These are all the best in breed, if you like, the best ones that they had at the time. And the simple invention here was made by Courter and designed by Pfundt and Hoffman is just a bar. And this is very quickly, this bar, which goes underneath the drum and is turned by one handle. So there's just this round handle. I'll take 1 minute just to describe the problem that we have. So, you have a hand-tuned timpani and you want to tune it quickly. What you need to be able to do is have something that pulls down the hoop completely evenly and completely silently, and it's silent when you play it, and it has to be quick, and it also has to relax to tune it down as well. And that's all under an incredible amount of tension, as we'll talk about with the pedals. And that's an extremely difficult task. It's almost like a sort of school engineering challenge, in that you have to work out how to do this, because these enormous heavy things, and you've just got to be able to pull this hoop down a couple of millimetres to change the note. You don't have to pull it very much to change the note, but you've got to do it completely evenly. Otherwise, it's completely pointless, and it's no better than a hand-tuned system. So this would have taken a lot of engineers, a lot of time, a lot of head scratching. But anyway, we've arrived, and these Pfundt drums are fantastic. And we think that they were in Bayreuth Opera House. The Ring was first performed in 1876. So Wagner almost certainly had these kind of drums. We actually talked about it earlier. There's various drums that have been in the Wagner Museum at Bayreuth, but certainly Tom and I have both seen ones like this in Bayreuth. And if we just we'll play a little bit of what are we going to play, Tom? Parsifal?
We could play, from Parsifal, from the first act of Parsifal, when they get to the Temple of the Knights of the Grail, then the bells in the temple are ringing, and it sounds more or less like... And of course, I was at a distinct disadvantage because I had to play the A and the E on very small drums, so that's why Adrian sounded great.
I think it sounded right. Interesting point there. Why was that 2 players? Well, up to that point, Berlioz moaned about players only being able to play 2 drums. If he wanted a third note, like, sorry, can't do that. Timpani were 2 things. The tradition of them being on the horse, taken off the horse, played in orchestras, tonic and dominant, it was just 2 notes. And it took quite a lot of persuasion. And Ernst Pfundt was one of the people that convinced Schumacher, for example, to write a 3rd note. Wow! A G flat in his first symphony. Schumann and Pfundt were very close in Leipzig, and so that 3rd note, which we now might take for granted in some of the 20th century stuff, but that was a seismic improvement. And the reason we had to play with that with 2 of us is because that was the tradition, that I'm one timpanist, I'm only going to play 2 notes. You're a timpanist, you're going to play, if you want 4 notes, 2 players. Great, happy days. But it meant a lot of sitting around for the 2nd timp in Parsifal. And nowadays, would you play that on your own? Or?
Yeah, we would play it on our own nowadays. First of all, there's no real reason not to. Secondly, there are very few pits in the world where you can really fit 2 sets in alongside all the huge string section and everything. Same with the ring. We play that with 1 player, apart from a few little passages. If you've got 8 horns, masses of double basses, bass trumpet, there's just no space for 2 sets in most pits.
We're going to look now at, if not one of the first pedals that was at all successful. This is again another quarter Leipzig invention. So it might be recognisable in the sense you could see it's a foot pedal, and I'll just try and operate it here. It's actually not too stiff, but these big cannonball things are obviously interesting. Now, this is to do with the pressure and the leverage. There's an awful lot of tension. One of the problems about that tuning thing is that there's an awful lot of tension. And if you release a pedal, I'm sure we've all done it, where you release the pedal and it comes shooting up. And it's very hard. We like to do a thing where we play released. So if we have a quiet roll, we like to be able to play with the pedal disengaged. And I can, if I'm a little bit out of tune. And that's hard on a heel attached system. We'll talk about that a bit later. So that counterweight adds weight to the other end of the pedal and helps push it down. So they're just weights. I think they're rather nice. But as you've already seen, these drums are incredibly heavy. I mean, they're much heavier, it seems to me, than modern symphonic timpani.
Each of these is about 110 kilos, so even heavier than I am.
There's an interesting point about that, and it's an interesting difference of the way orchestras started. So in Germany, it doesn't really matter how heavy you make a timp, because the custom is that they have lots of orchestras in lots of towns, and they don't travel around very much. So you make a timp and you leave it. What a good idea. And you just leave it in the theatre, and if you want some in the concert hall, you get some more. And you were saying, Tom, the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra doesn't have a truck, is that right?
Yeah, this might be a surprise to people who are familiar with British orchestras, for example, that tend to travel around to the surrounding area. You might do a concert in your hometown and then the day after somewhere else, the day after somewhere else. German orchestras generally don't do that because in most sort of middle-sized to larger towns, there is an orchestra that's resident there. So for example, we don't actually have a truck of our own because when we go on tour, then it's a big tour, 3 weeks or whatever, but we're not sort of traveling around from day to day.
And so, but for the British orchestras, the British custom is always to have far fewer orchestras, but they travel around more. So most of the regional orchestras in Britain now, Bournemouth and Birmingham, places like that, Manchester, Scotland, and Cardiff, of course, they're travelling around all the time. And so the British musician has always been much more on the move, and it's just a tradition that's built up. So for us, it is a consideration how heavy these things are. So you really wouldn't want to be moving them. And another thing about the tuning, you've got to think about, well, if you have to move it, is it going to be okay if you bump them? And people still take these things around the world, and so that's a whole new complication. That's the quarter pedals, and I think now we will move on to something over here. These drums are also from Leipzig, a quarter, Richard Ludwig. So he was one of the timpanists of Leipzig Gewandhaus, like Mr. Pfundt.
Yeah, Karl Richard Ludwig was one of my predecessors for about 10 years towards the end of the 19th century. And he was, about sort of 40 years after Ernst Pfundt. And he was very interested in in progressing the whole mechanics of the timpani, making them even better. And he got together with with the other Karl Quarter. It was Karl Quarter, Karl with a K, who was making those with Ernst Pfundt, and then Karl with a K, his son, Karl with a C, Quarter, produced these towards the end of the 19th century with Ludwig.
So there are two of them, so it's really half, not a quarter. Hey, thank you. So these, maybe there were two more quarters. These drums, several interesting things. The Royal Academy of Music has some drums which were made by Quarter as well, which were imported into England, and they're known as the Henry Wood drums, used at that part of history. But what's interesting is that England, we didn't really take on these big heavy drums. That was obviously partly to do with possibly the political situation in the first half of the century with Germany, but also, again, this thing as I mentioned earlier about the travel. So these drums were very rare, and there's actually one nice story I'd like to bring in at this point. That a friend of mine discovered a photograph in St Paul's School in Hammersmith. It's a public, private, expensive fee-paying school, but it is just a normal school, and there's a photo there. It was discovered by Matt Dickinson, a friend of mine, and Rodney Newton, two English percussionists, and they found this photo, or mentioned it to me, with a girl student of the school playing what looks like some Dresden timpani. And it's absolutely extraordinary because this is in the mid-20s, and this just wasn't really happening very much in England generally, but it's absolutely extraordinary that it did happen in a school. We don't know what happened to those drums. I have some English way round Dresdens of around the time, so who knows, that would be a nice thought. And also there's an interesting story about the girl, possibly, but I'll leave that for another time because it needs a bit more digging on that one. Just about this drum, if Tom gets close, you can see this head is lapped on to the hoop. That's something that continued in with Viennese Schnellerpauken, for example, and that has some crucial differences. It doesn't have a second hoop, and what that means is that the head is lapped around what we call the counter hoop and fixed on. One major consideration means that the head, therefore, has to be usually a little bit thicker than what we might think of a modern head today. Otherwise, it can tear, particularly if you play as loudly as we did in that Parsifal. So, this leads us on to a very, very important point, which is crucial, that timpani skins changed fundamentally from around 1850. So before then, Bach, Handel, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Berlioz possibly even, none of them ever heard the kind of timpani sound we hear today, because the heads were thicker. And that's also because the drums were smaller. I'll talk about this another time. It's a very complicated area, but rather like the principle of violin strings, where the G string on a violin is much thicker than the E string, if you have a smaller timpani playing the same notes, because we still play the same notes now as we did 400 years ago, then you need the skin to be much thicker to work with a small timpani. Around this time, they improved timpani heads to something called Glasfell, clear skins, and that most of the timpani we see, you'll see us playing today, have these clear heads. At the time they were being played, in Mendelssohn Schumann's time, I'm pretty sure there was a mixture going on. I'm not sure these new heads would have been available to everybody. And of course, the one thing that's difficult with heads is that they tend not to survive. If you see a head in a museum, it may have been something that's just put there for show. And of course, Tom will agree with this, the good heads, you play them out and you throw them away. And they're disposable items rather like oboe reeds. So we don't really know much for sure about the heads of the time. We know lots about the metalwork because that survives, but we don't know about the heads. So that's the turn of the century timpani. Again, an awfully heavy beast. And it's got this fine tuner. We can see that kind of Porter trademark there. And that's that. Tom, should we have a quick chat about sticks? Every timpani starts to chat about sticks. So, over here we've got a little display of some sticks. And again, in baroque times, it was standard to use wood, and Berlioz particularly moans about wood, that it just makes this relentless sound. He wanted colours and different sounds. And so timpanists obviously being creative beings, and perhaps with the odd slow movement to sit around thinking about what to do, they started covering. There's evidence of coverings from quite an early time. Leather is a standard way to do it, so here's some leather ones that I did myself, which are... These roughly conform to the sort of dimensions that Mr. Pfundt talks about in his book. I'll come back to them again another time. And so there's some leather cover sticks, but the main thing they're really interested in talking about is sponge. Now, this is interesting because this is sea sponge, and I think it's from the Mediterranean, but wherever it's from, Leipzig is a long way from the sea, and Paris, where Berlioz was working, is also quite a long way from the sea. It's also a long way from the Mediterranean. And Tom and I were chatting yesterday, wondering why there was this obsession with sponge when they had good cloth and all sorts of other things that you could cover timpani sticks with. One thought is that they had the fluffier kind of sponge wrapped in a piece of cloth to make something akin to what we might think of as a fluffy stick today. But I don't really know why sponge is so asked for, except it does sound very good. So here's some sponge. Sound quite hard, but believe me, in a less helpful acoustic, you would be able to play quite beautifully, and it would have been a revelation to have that sound on those older heads, particularly the branch record. So something a bit more like a heartbeat and a bit less like a woodpecker.
Yeah.
Yeah? So it's all about trying to find colours, and as the drums got bigger with more sustain, and the timpani parts got more involved, then there was an opportunity for timpanists to be a bit more creative. Tom, should we talk about these extraordinary things?
Tip this over. Okay, yeah, that's good.
So these are by Puschmann, and they're from 1880. So they might look incredibly old, but actually they're not really very old. 1880 is sort of Brahms symphony time. And this is, again, a fantastic idea, but obviously incredibly heavy, and there seems quite a lot that could go wrong. One of the interesting things about timpani at this time is, of course, these are all the ones that are quite good and worked, but some of them wouldn't have worked, and there must have been some fantastic errors where a timpanist tried to change the note and everything just jammed solid. So, of course, these aren't documented, sadly. We certainly don't get to hear about them. But these timpani wouldn't have always been utterly reliable until they were developed. But these are certainly usable. However, if I demonstrate, these are quite in good condition, but if I try and tune it, that's all those cogs at the bottom. If Tom just shows us those cogs again. That's all those cogs going round, which is a bit of a nightmare. And so there's a lot of friction and a lot of problem in there that it's quite hard to tune. And I'm just going to say, I'm not sure this is quieter or quicker than playing the hand-tuned timpani. So, we've seen some interesting developments, haven't we? We've seen single crank timpani by Courter and Pfundt. We've seen the early pedals, and we've seen some of the later pedals that went to England, and now this slightly unusual design. And maybe, Tom, should we go and talk about the Dresdens?
Great to talk about Dresdens, always.
We'll do that later.
Yeah.
Right. Holly, red one. Yeah.
So, Dresden pedal timpani. These are the famous Jena und Borówka Dresden timpani from sort of middle of the 1920s. So between the wars, what's very interesting for any of you who are familiar with the bowls of Dresden timpani that are normally really very rounded, these have a very interesting, the side of the bowl, you can see it here, it goes down very, very straight before it then goes in, which is much more akin to the ringer bowls that so many of us are familiar with now. Now, these may look very small to you, they are actually. This is about a 62 centimeter, when normally it would be 66 today. Yeah, and now we get to the Dresden pedals that we're familiar with today, because when we play with Dresden timpani that were made after the Second World War, they basically look the same. And there's one fundamental problem with these pedals, and that problem is
the leverage is difficult because this the pedal is quite short. The distance between the top of the pedal and the bottom of the pedal is not very long. Now, if you think about, for those of you that drive, if you were driving a car and the accelerator is operated by your toes, so our toes are much more kind of sensitive and able to do minute adjustments than our heels are. However, it does mean that there's this lot of tension on the toe, on your whole leg, and you need sort of thighs like Maradona to really play these things released. It also means that the fine tuner, what we call the fine tuner, is on the far side of the drum, and we'll come to a clever solution for this in a minute. But the Dresdens, again, it's a problem of playing with the pedal release. Tom, can you just show us what you do when you're playing released? So he's releasing his foot so that the pedal can actually go up and down while he's playing it. And that's okay if you're sort of playing noisy, loud things, and if you get the odd scrape or something, it's fine. But if you're playing really quietly and then you suddenly decide you want to release the pedal, this is not so easy. Have you got any anecdotes about pedal? Pedal things?
I think everyone watching will have enough anecdotes about.
Yeah.
So.
They're the Dresdens. Do you want to give us a blast or something?
Yeah. No idea what that sounds like to you, but it's an absolutely astonishingly beautiful sound. It really, really is. Although it's such a small drum, in inches it would be about a 24. It's 62 centimeters, and it really sounds like it's just so stable. And
Do you still play old Dresdens in your orchestra?
we do. Well, old in the sense that they weren't built in the last 30 years or so. They're from just shortly after the war, from the mid-50s. And we still use them. Yeah, sure.
And do you find metal fatigue? I mean, no matter how good a drum is, anything metal can survive with being flayed too much. Could start bending, pardon the pun, but it can get loose, and metal things get loose and also wear out after a time. So you were telling me you had some bowls that were put in other frames?
Yeah, because all our Dresden timpani bowls are absolutely gorgeous, and there's a real glow on them. The problem, as Adrian said, is the frames, because the aluminium that was used sort of 10, 15 years after the war was pretty ropey. So the four struts of the timpani, with time they start to bend because they're under so much pressure, and there's just a lot of weight in the timpani. And if those four struts don't bend at quite the same degree, which is how it always works out, then the whole mechanism underneath the bowl that pulls the counter hoop won't pull the counter hoop evenly, and then you move. Yeah, the skin might be beautifully lapped and put on the timpani, might be really true in its intonation, but you move the pedal 2,000 times and it's just completely out.
Timpani are probably, this might be a terrible thing to say, but we probably ought to consider them as disposable items, in the sense that it seems like violins, string instruments, get better with age. Wooden string instruments, but most other instruments, wood and brass certainly deteriorate. Woodwind instruments tend to crack over time. And all these things, again, it's just one thing to look out for, I always think. If someone says, oh, I've found these fantastic old timpani in a museum, they're immaculate, I would immediately worry. Because anything immaculate that's old means it hasn't been used. And anything good that's old has been used. And with timpani, even if you only occupy a few halls or theatres, they do get dropped and they do have wear and tear, as Tom just explained, with a number of pedal presses and all that kind of stuff. They do wear out. Just like aeroplane wings, and the Uri Geller thing with the fork metal just wears out and breaks. So with the best will in the world, probably none of the instruments in this room, if they were played all the time, will be terribly viable in 100 years' time. Perhaps the secret is, if you've got as many drums as the Leipzig Gewandhaus have, is that you could bring them out for certain special occasions. But if they were gigging on the road, or even not on the road all the time, then drums certainly will suffer. And how different do you think? I mean, these are 92. They're almost exactly. I mean, we don't know the exact date, but they're basically 100 years old. And you were telling me about your Hartka timpani that you had built recently. You were telling me about the bowls.
Yeah, because personally, I find that the bowls that are made in what we now call the sort of ringer shape, so rather than being very round like that, but going down straighter and then in at the bottom, the overtones tend to be much, much stronger. You can see it very clearly here, that there's a sort of, at about here, the bowl suddenly goes in like that, rather than being very round. And that actually helps to get a much more overtone-rich sound, and that's where you get your projection from, particularly the larger the orchestra is, and playing with a more sort of thick, you have a thick wall of sound in front of you when you're playing in a concert hall, and we can project far better if we really allow the overtones to allow the brighter side of the colours that we're making to really fly across the orchestra. And that bowl shape, who knows how much of a coincidence it was, but that really helps. And that's the shape that Günther Ringer adopted in the 50s and 60s.
And these, if we think back to the first Pfundt drums that we saw, the green ones at the beginning of the talk, I mentioned that bar, the tuning bar across the bottom. And if you look at this drum, essentially, I'm just going to say there's basically no difference in terms of the principle of how it works. The bar has got a little bit thinner and a bit more lightweight, and everything is a bit more efficient. But fundamentally, this drum works the same. It's got 6 or 8 struts. This is free. The kettle's hung, and it's got what was the big round tuning handle on the Pfundt drum is now what we call the fine tuner. Or we can think of it as a rangefinder. So if we turn up for a morning rehearsal, it's been raining, and the drums are generally quite flabby and flat, we just turn it up a few turns and kind of get our D and A in the bit of the range or wherever we need them to be. So this handle here is 2 things. It started out life really as to get the range correct for the drums, but it's turned into something which we'll come on to in a minute. But basically these drums are not much different to the Pfundts. And if we go back to the Pfundts just for a second, there is one difference I should mention, is that you'll see here, this is what we call the collar for non-timpanists. So the gap between the head and the hoop, how big that is. And you can see on here, it's very, very small. This is more akin to a sort of early 19th century drum, a hand-tuned drum. And most modern drums have a bigger collar, because a bigger collar gives more resonance, we think. A bit like the principle of a violin string. If the string is mounted sort of horizontally with a bridge, and there's more each side, whereas if the string is run around a rather sort of right-angled corner, it's difficult. It's the same with timpani skins, that it's all crushed in together. So these will be less resonant. And this might be a good point to talk very briefly about a new little idea I've had. We've always referred to timpani by their diameter. We're accustomed, I think it's fair to say, that timpani are referred to by their diameter. So in England we might say 26 and a 29 or 25 and 28, and we instantly know what we mean. We mean the middle pair, and they're kind of quite big and quite modern. And that's fine if we're dealing with those. All of those drums have the same kind of a volume in terms of the volume of the kettle, in litres, if you imagine filling it up with beer or something else. And they all have the same kind of length of sound. But 24-inch timpani, going back hundreds of years, sometimes they would have been the D drum of quite a small pair or the big drum of a Baroque pair. And in real Baroque times, 24s didn't even exist. So this is a problem because this word 24 starts to mean less the further back you go. And I had to think about this, and I'll release something next week about it when I've sort of fully permeated these thoughts. But if we think about the way composers wrote for timpani and the sustain of how long they ring on, and also the maximum volume, that Parsifal we just played was just something, it's just too loud to be possibly played on something smaller. And I came up with this idea that because Bach and Handel basically wrote in crotchets or quarter notes, and the kind of maximum is what we call a whole note or a semi-brief, 4 beats, then we can express timpani in terms of a thing called Q. Q being quaver. I'm sorry, it's an English word, it doesn't conform to the American 8th note, but quaver. And so we can call drums by a Q name. So 2Q would be something with a very short attack, quite a low minimum volume, suitable for Bach and Handel. Whereas these drums are kind of getting into the sort of 5, 6, 7 area of Q. They've got a longer sustain, as you heard from that Parsifal. They're louder, and they're playing music that has longer notes in it. And the 8Q would be kind of modern day plastic drums, Ludwig Premier, those kind of things. And also the bigger calfskin pedal timpani, we'll see later, playing the biggest, loudest symphonic things with big orchestras in big halls. And so that scale, 2 to 8Q, might just be a way. So maybe I could say to Tom, I'm going to watch a concert tonight, very excited to see that. What drums are you playing? And he could say, well, they're 5Q. And that instantly tells me quite a lot. Okay, so I know that they're kind of smallish, and they're not as small as Handel's timps, obviously, but they're smaller and quieter and more punchy and more clear than these. I've just seen someone walk through the door, and I've never met Leo. I don't think Tom's ever met Leo. Leo has come here from...
Just got off the plane.
Lovely to meet you.
Hello.
Leo Soto.
Great to see you.
Yeah.
How are you doing? Very nice meeting you. Yeah, pleasure to be here, absolutely.
Tell us something about why you came over and everything.
Why wouldn't I? I mean, this is magnificent, and I'm still trying to digest all these instruments that we don't have in the United States, and I want to learn as much as possible the history and how instruments have progressed over the years. As you know, we know in the United States probably we have the evolution of the timpani. That's what we live with, and just every once in a while we get some rare instruments, and it rarely gets played in an American orchestra. So just to see this and get information and just get in touch with how this works is fantastic.
So it's absolutely brilliant that he's come along, and we're delighted to have him along.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
come and join in the discussion.
Sure.
We're going to show you something quite unusual. I'm not going to start from the beginning again, but we're going to talk about some drums over here. So these, now we're up to 1930. So what have we dealt with? Let's have a recap. We've done hand-tuned. We've done the first ever crank timpani by Courter and Pfundt, and then we've got the early pedals, and then we've got some later pedals that are kind of sort of similar to what we've got today. But even later, there's actually some other interesting ideas. Tom was playing these Rotary tips. These are by Wunderlich, and these are dated at 1930. Surprisingly late, perhaps, but usable for earlier music. Tom's going to show us these Wunderlichs. So they are what we call rotary timpani, tuning with a mechanism underneath, a very clever bit of engineering. Now, they're not very popular anymore. They've kind of died out. What tends to happen is that the best things survive, and clearly people think that the best things are pedals. I think these are quite good. There's one massive disadvantage in that we're all used to having a beating spot. So when we set up pedal timpani, as these are, we tend to want to play, or we have to play in the same point all the time because that's where the pedal is. But in olden times, certainly when I'm playing smaller drums, I'm forever playing in different points around the head. And that's because some of the points are very good. I'm trying to get some better light here. Some of the points are very good and some of them are less good. So if I'm doing something really important, I want to be on my best playing spots. But if I'm doing a rehearsal, say, or in a really big acoustic, I can use maybe the spot that doesn't sound so good. So these drums don't have a front and a back, which means you can play anywhere. Right. So you don't really have a beating spot. So from my perspective, it's not really a disadvantage that you would lose a beating spot. The backbone, Ernst Pfundt again talks about the backbone, and we can use the backbone to play a little bit more percussively. I'm not sure you'll be able to hear it, but if that's the kind of normal position, and then I think we can hear that in the room, but maybe we can't hear it on the internet. But that's definitely a more boomy sound. This is kind of where we would all play it normally, but on the backbone,
lose resonance. And this was the idea behind those the design that Fred Hinger made in the United States, where the frame stays put, but you can rotate the kettle around. Yeah, that was the exact same concept.
Unless the only distance, I mean, it's a brilliant. I think it's actually a good idea. Unless you happen to do a bit of crossing over and your playing spots are completely opposed.
Right.
If it's crossing over, it's so loud, and you probably can't hear the beauty of the sound. So I'm actually going to put in a positive vote for the Rotary timpani. They're lovely and clever, and with these beautiful heads on, they kind of sound okay. Right, let's move on. I think it's Tom's turn. Tom's telling me about these timpani, more timpani.
Yeah, so the fascinating thing about these is these timpani are made by Wunderlich in Altenburg, which is it's a small town about 3/4 of an hour south of Leipzig, so within the state of Saxony. And the fascinating thing is, some of you will have already seen now, that they do not have Dresden pedals. Now, normally on German type of timpani, we refer to Berlin pedals or Dresden pedals, and the Dresden pedals have the fulcrum of the mechanism on the player's side. That the rocker bar is here, and as we were saying, you use the sensitivity of your toe to move the lever of the pedal, and that makes the pedal very short, and it's under a lot of tension. And what a lot of us like about the Berlin pedal system is that the fulcrum of the lever system is at the back, and the pedal itself, the foot plate, is brought closer to the player, so that makes the actual distance between the rocker bar and the heel of the pedal much longer, so you have much more leverage. So you don't need as much power from your legs to be able to actually move the pedal. And as I said, these timpani were made in Saxony, not in Berlin. So the Berlin pedal, which obviously came after the Dresden pedal, actually wasn't a development that was made in Berlin. We refer to it now as a Berlin pedal because Ringer and Winkelmann and Hartke, the great timpani makers in Berlin, that's where it's situated now, and where it was sort of developed more in post-war times when Ringer started. But actually, these first timpani that were between the two wars were the first Berlin system pedals ever, and as I said, from Wunderlich in Altenburg, which is just south of Leipzig. So it is a Saxon invention, the Berlin pedal.
And I think it's worth saying that, as Tom said, Leipzig is kind of, or this part of Germany is I think we can call it the epicenter of timpani development. If you think of Cremona with violins, then I think we can call Leipzig the home of timpani of this kind, because what's remarkable is all these different little manufacturers and engineers all doing this stuff within a very close area. Particularly must feel close for an American to have this kind of stuff going on within Texas is probably how big's Texas? How big's Texas? How many Germany's in Texas?
Oof.
Anyway,
yeah,
hundreds of miles. So for a Texan, Altenburg's just you go there for coffee. There's a couple of interesting things about these. That's as I may have hinted earlier, the fact that the pedal's turned around, as Tom talked about, means that the tuner is now on this side. Woo! This is exciting
No more
and
reason
important.
across.
It's exciting and important because it means that if I'm playing something quiet and difficult, I can tune it and nobody knows. And people always comment, when I play a lot of hand tuned drums, they say, you're forever fiddling with them, you're forever tuning and you're leaning down and you're messing around. And I'm like, yeah, because they go out of tune. But Leo and Tom are doing that as well. Modern timpanists are everybody. When I play modern timpani, they say, when you play pedal tips, you look really relaxed. Yeah, because they have pedals and they have all these levers and helpful things that help me get them in tune. The hand tuned timpani, you can see every single thing that we're doing. But what you have to remember is if you see a hand tuned timpani player doing that, the modern guys are doing that as well, because the drums go out of tune, and things like if we want to play quieter, we might want to tune the drum slightly differently, have a very different note within the pitch. So this rangefinder, as I talked about on the Red Dresdens, now becomes a fine tuner, and we see them a little bit more efficient to use than this. And there's just one other thing I want to talk about on these drums is that we are often told that freely hanging bowls are wonderful and amazing, which they are, but these don't have freely hanging bowls. The struts are clamped into the side, as they are on the Rotary ones.
Right.
And this suggests, again, Tom and I were chatting about this earlier, rather like a violin, if you put a chin rest on it, it doesn't necessarily kill the resonance. This is a box to make the sound of the skin resonate.
Right.
And so I don't have enough research on this, but I'm not sure the free kettle is as important as all that. If we're talking about back to my Q numbers, of course, anything in the bowl may reduce reduce resonance, but as we can all talk about forever, is how much resonance is a good idea anyway? Do we want drums that are ringing massively all the time? So I'm not sure this is a terrible disadvantage.
Most of those cheaper line of Ludwig drums were all built, the frame of it within the kettle. So it didn't really make much difference, I don't think.
The other big thing to talk about is whether having mechanism inside the kettle, how much of a disadvantage is that?
Right.
There's some on the Kolberg catalogue to do with this exhibition. There's some very extraordinary things where there's mechanism going on inside the kettle. But as I said, all these ones seem to be the kind of the top of the range, which would suggest that maybe they moved away.
It may also help make it easier, making some adjustments to the kettle, like getting it off the frame and put it back on the frame. For some adjustments, I see that done a lot, where the frame comes off if you want to work on the mechanism of the instrument, and then you put it back on.
Absolutely,
That could
yeah.
be another advantage.
Yeah, I think with the thing with timpani, there are so many factors. It's very hard to work out. You have three different timpani. One could just have a bad head.
Right.
It doesn't mean it's a bad design. Speaking of weird designs, well, not weird designs, but this is a very different design. We're now going to go on to the Viennese timpani. And if you think about resonance being killed by, this bowl is not hanging at all. This is the crucial point of how these drums work. So all the drums we've seen so far all operate by whatever method, all these weird and wonderful methods, they all operate by the hoop being pulled downwards. And the bowl stays where it is, and the hoop moves downwards from Pfundt up to Ludwig Premier, Yamaha today, Adams, whoever. That's what they're mostly doing. But these Viennese timpani, this is the Viennese style. They're still made by Wunderlich. I don't know if we can see this, but when I tune it, can we see anything moving?
Yes, a little bit.
So what's happening now is the bowl is being pushed up. And the bowl is being, so there's instead of this thing pulling the hoop down, the lever, which is operated off the handle I just turned, pushes the bowl upwards.
Right.
And it's exactly the same end result, in that the same changes going on at the top. It's a fundamentally different approach. And if I slacken this right off, we might be able to bowl, some of these bowls wobble quite a lot. I've got some Viennese schnellers, and there's nothing attached, and the bowls are really quite wobbly when you don't have any tension on. They're lovely and light, but they're also quite bad for moving because the heads can move around terribly. So, and these are popular still to this day in Vienna, obviously, and many other orchestras. What one thing we haven't talked about is tuning gauges. These don't have any tuning gauges.
Right.
And the guys in Vienna are obviously phenomenal. They can play operas, Strauss, Die Frau ohne Schatten and Salome, Rosenkavalier. There's some lovely film music on YouTube of John Williams.
They even play John Williams.
With John Williams.
Yeah.
And I think if you can play John Williams on these, then you've kind of reached
Yeah.
the pinnacle. So
They have that very well down system of how much turn it needs per half steps. That's what I've noticed they work a lot on.
yeah, it's quite a coarse thread, so you don't have to move it very much. And when I met one of the Vienna timpanists, he told me a lovely story. He said, if I need a B and an F sharp, but the music is in B flat, I just tune them into B flat and F, and then when it just comes to the last minute, I know how much to turn it.
Exactly.
Which is incredible.
Yeah,
He can just turn it and go bang.
It's like everything we do with our feet consistently, they do it with their hands.
Yeah.
As they play with the other.
And going back to sort of heels and toes, tuning with your hands is actually really nice. Well, I love tuning with my hands. I find it much
You're an expert.
very intuitive. It's just custom on what we're used to.
Right.
Okay, I think it's time to move on. Tom, your turn. How about some of these over here?
Okay, now, when you see these, you'll see, okay, looks like a Dresden bowl. Yeah, looks like Dresden frame, very Dresden color, the red of the time. These were actually made in Leipzig by Pfundt just after the war, and it's a fascinating pedal system that most of us will never have seen before. And the problem was with Dresden pedals, because you don't actually use your leg for leverage. You have to use your ankle, and then your foot moves. And when the timpani are under pressure, then it's you need a lot of strength, and it's very strenuous. And these pedals were designed for a timpanist who we don't know any longer who it was, but a timpanist who lost his leg in the war and still needed to play in post-war times and needed to be able to tune them. So pressure was taken off by the fulcrum of the pedal being here. As you can see, here's the rocker arm and the fulcrum of the pedal being here. And then with your toe, you would release it here, and then you'd be able to use the weight of your leg going, so you had a false leg. So the weight of pushing down through your false leg onto the heel here to actually move it. So Adrian, if you could just hold it. Are you seeing it? Yeah, okay. So foot on here, and then you release it like this, and then you can actually use the movement and the weight going through your leg to move the pedal. But it hasn't survived as a system in our little timpani world, but it's fascinating, and it works.
It's quite compact and
works.
simple. I mean, it hasn't got the leverage because the foot being over the rocker arm, it's actually the shortest pedal I think I've ever seen of this type, which means that it's problematic with like releasing and playing high notes. I always think of the last roll in Scheherazade, an E, and if you play released and it goes on a long time, that could be that's good for the leg, good for the calf muscles, isn't it?
And then it's last orders.
Exactly. So that's the Pfundt timpani. They're from about 1950 as well. So I think finally we're going to make our way around to these. And this is a set of 4 Dresden timpani. The immediate thing to say about these is that only 2 of them have pedals, which could seem like a terrible disadvantage. But quite often when I advise students to do auditions, most things some things that go on in auditions are when you kind of try to move your feet and you play on these 2 and then that one's out of tune, and then you're dancing and you're sort of tap dancing as well as trying to just play well. And so I think it was traditional, going back to that thought about a pair of drums and extra drums when you need them, that they very much thought of, I've got a pair of timpani, and this is an extra one. So the instrument is two things, and I've got a spare one because I really need it. I don't want it, but I really need it. So the thought nowadays that Tom might, or Leo might think of, I've got a lovely set of 4 or 5, whatever it is, that's a very, very 20th century concept. And a lot of people, even like Goodman certainly, played with mixed sets quite a lot, so a couple of Dresdens and a hand-tuned. And that's absolutely fine. So the philosophy in the early part of the century, even when pedals came in, they were like, why would you have 4 pedals? And actually, why would you have 4 different sizes? Labordas in the concert about, he was around. I'm old enough to have seen him in the 70s and the 80s maybe. But he played apparently with two 226s, 229s. And so the concept of bigger timpani is very modern. And that's possibly because the range is extended. So even up to as late as Strauss, I mean, it goes down to bottom D on occasion, goes up to top A, the right of spring with a B, but we're still in kind of normal, those are very exceptional cases. The vast majority of music up until, well, forever has still been in that range of about just more than the Beethoven octave. So E flat, low E flat, up to about G. And that's basically possible on 2 pairs of timpani. So the concept of, I need a bigger drum, a 30 or a 31 or 32 is very, very modern. And these drums have straps on them. And you can almost sort of strap your feet in to, so that you don't have any nasty accidents with things making a noise. But that means if you kind of consider that you're strapped into the middle pair, and then the outer pair you just leave on, say, low F and high F. And there's another thing about this is that I find that the fewer notes that you have to kind of worry about, if you think, well, that's an F, and then if you think, well, I've turned it to a G and then I'm doing this, the more drums you tune, the harder it gets. If I prefer, when I'm playing a big set like this, is kind of to leave the big one and then play most of any fast pedalling in the middle. And if I really want a big fat F, of course, I find an F, but I might put it back. So I would play less probably on the outer drums than the middle pair. And certainly anything very difficult, try and keep the majority of the tuning in the middle. Keep your feet safe, and for auditions, I think that's a very good.
To your point, if you ever heard all these old Cleveland Orchestra recordings with George Snell, that was Cloyd Off playing timpani. He had 2 Dresden pedals drum in the middle, and then 2 cable drums on the outside, 32, 23, 28 and 25. So all of his tunings always happen in the middle drums, and then the outsides were normally set for either the lower or the higher notes. And also, the other point is when it comes to auditioning, you have more control of pedaling on 2 drums, especially when they're foreign, when you don't know which kind of drums you're playing on, rather than trying to move around.
That's an absolutely fantastic point with auditions,
right,
where you mostly have to play drums you don't know. For any non-timpanists out there, the hardest thing about our job is probably when we have to guest for other orchestras. If you know your drums and you're playing something very difficult, well, you might have a little go in a rehearsal of something else the week before, you know where your notes are. We kind of learn where our C's and D's and E flats are on our D drum. But if you go into an audition, or they can say, oh, the range is from B up to F sharp, great, fine. I don't know how much to push it down. I don't know what it feels like to make that tuning. So I think all 3 of us would probably agree that in auditioning, think tactically about how you're going to actually play those excerpts, and it probably won't be as easy as the instruments you've been using in your college.
Yeah. Strategize way, so it makes your life much more simple on drums so you don't know.
So Leo, do you feel like playing something for us?
Why not?
What do you fancy doing?
How about, I can try and play it one time.
Okay.
I never played on these drums before, so...
Right.
Is that okay?
You play what you like.
Do you have a name? Does anybody have a name?
we've got about 2 minutes. I think Tom's going to send us out with a blast. But I'm going to show you a very strange, interesting pair of timpani, just for a minute or two, over for a second. These are also Dresden timpani. They might not look like anything you've ever seen before. They're from the 1980s, so from the former East Germany. And they really conform to all the other things that we've been talking about. They've got a pedal. They've now got a grip rod system, which became much popular. They've got fine tuners, and they've got tuning gauges, and they're essentially the same system as Mr. Pfundt back all those years ago. So these are just some very unusual timpani. And weirdly, I went to see a percussion player in England quite recently, and he had a couple in his garden. And I don't know how they got to England, a bit like the Henry Wood drums coming over to England. These Eastern German drums came over to England. So some more Dresdens. I think Tom's going to play something loud and noisy. And just to say thank you very much for joining us today. I'm sorry it's been a sort of slightly murky run around, but I hope you've been able to see and hear most of what we've been doing. And so I'll say goodbye from Leo.
Thanks for joining.
And from Tom.
Goodbye from me. Thank you.
Goodbye from me, and I hope you recognise this. This is Tom.